Morning, folks. Welcome to the Mass Climate Action Network's meeting for April. And we have a terrific program for you today. My name is Fred Davis. I am the president of the organization. I will be turning this over to Jack Lundgren in just a moment. I just want to say thanks, everyone, for being here. We'll be letting people in for the next couple of minutes. But I also want to acknowledge we have a bit of a glitch this morning. The MCAN server went down, our website went down in the last couple of days, surprising all of us, and we are scrambling to get it back up. And so there will be a couple of people, hopefully not too many, who tried to register for the program at the last minute and found our registration process not available. So for them in advance, we're apologizing, and we will, of course, make the recording available to all. But of course, if you're here, you're here. Fantastic. So with that, and we're going to keep letting people in, but we're going to get started with Jack's introductory remarks. Thank you, Jack, and thank you, Eric Masanet. Thank you very much for this program. And also, Fatima and Mary, behind the scenes, thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you so much, Fred. Let's get rolling now. So, welcome everyone. Thank you for being here to MCAN's April Network Zoom happening today, noon, April 13th, 2026. My name is Jack Lundgren, and I direct the Embodied Carbon Initiatives here at MCAN. And the title of today's program is The Carbon Costs of the Internet, and we are very fortunately being joined today by Dr. Eric Masanet from the University of California, Santa Barbara. Right off the bat, I want to please ask yourself, please rename yourself by clicking on the three dots in the corner of your image, or alternatively, you can put them into the chat, any preferred pronouns, the town or city that you are from, and any organizations that you might be representing. For those of you who are unfamiliar with our work, the Massachusetts Climate Action Network seeks to accelerate equitable decarbonization in Massachusetts by empowering local residents, advocates, and community members to take action. MCAN was founded in 2000. MCAN provides a network and expertise to help local groups take action on the climate. MCAN is a network of organizations, including over 60 chapters and thousands of amazing advocates like yourself. One of MCAN's issue priorities is the reduction of embodied carbon in Massachusetts. So I want to take a moment to invite you to scan this QR code on your screen. It will take you to a form that you can input details about any upcoming public construction projects happening in your community. And this is because MCAN offers a model RFP language resource that helps community climate advocates take action on embodied carbon, specifically embodied carbon in new municipal construction. So if you know about any public construction projects happening in your community, I invite you to scan the QR code, fill out the form, and then MCAN will follow up and provide access to that model RFP language resource and support any efforts in implementing it. I also invite you to fill out that form if you are interested in that work. And there is a link to the form that I can put into the chat once I'm done with this introduction. MCAN also puts on regular Zoom programs. And then on the screen here, you can see some of the recent MCAN programs that we've put on. The recordings of these are available on our YouTube, and they're generally available on our website. We are having some technical difficulties with our website, but hope to get that resolved soon. So you'll be able to check back there soon, hopefully, and see those recordings and also the slides that will be posted there. I also want to briefly announce some of our exciting upcoming program. The May Networks program will feature a presentation by Ryan Zizzo about the City of Toronto's approach to addressing embodied carbon. And then in June, MCAN's board president, Fred Davis, will be leading a training on the Decarbonizers program. Again, keep checking to see when our website is back up, and you can use our events webpage there to RSVP. And I encourage you all to do so once available. The session today will be recorded. It is being recorded right now. If you have questions, I ask that you please hold until after the initial presentation. Also, please hold chats until after the initial presentation. At that point, you'll be given the opportunity to raise your digital hand under the Reactions tab to be recognized. Also, please mute when not speaking. Keep your comments brief, and just know that we may not be able to address all questions and comments. Again, I ask you to please rename yourself. You can do that by clicking on the three dots in the upper right corner of your image, or alternatively put into the chat preferred pronouns, the town or city that you're from, and any applicable organizations. I want to give a brief shout out as well to the Jam Park Charitable Trust, whose generous funding makes programs like this possible. Thank you. And also want to give a brief shout out to all the MCAN advocates in our network who have donated to our work. That those donations support programs like this. Our donations webpage is down with the rest of our website, so you don't need to do any urgent donations, but I just ask that you please consider supporting our work. Thank you. And thank you all again for joining. Feel free to follow us on social media. And with that, I want to turn it over to Eric. Eric, thank you so much for joining and being with us today.
Thank
So
you,
I
Jack.
stopped there.
Let me work on sharing my screen so we can get started. But thanks, Jack, for the context and for the introduction. And thanks to MCAN and Fred and Mary for the invitation to chat with you today. So as the title suggests, what I'll be talking about is the carbon cost of the internet and a bit more broadly, the environmental
in terms of like the new file and the
impacts
table,
of the
are they covering those costs,
internet.
or are they expecting us to?
Okay, sorry.
Sorry, I think we got unmuted. Go ahead. Thank you.
We're all good. Okay, all right. So what I'll be talking about today is the environmental impacts of what we call the internet. I'll be zooming in on data centers, which is a topic I'm sure you've all heard about if you're paying attention to the news or what's happening in courthouses and legislatures all around the country. And I've been doing this for about 20 years. So what I'd love to do today is just to give everyone a sense of what we know about the impacts of data centers, where experts think those impacts are going, and arm you with some information that you can use to perhaps make better decisions about your own use of technology. But also, if you're interested in pushing for more sustainable data centers, what some opportunities might be. So. The internet is a vast system. It's pretty much intrinsic to everything we do these days in all aspects of life. But just to define it with a little bit more nuance. So the internet is comprised of really four things, or three things, as you see in this graph. Cryptocurrency we can set aside for another day. But this is a graph from a recent paper which is summarizing recent estimates about the electricity use of the internet. So the internet is comprised of data centers, which is, these are the large centers where the files are stored on the internet, where the programs run. Anytime you buy something from an online shopper, it's going through a data center. There's also networks, which is how the data gets from the data center to you as an individual. And then, of course, we all interact with the internet using what are known as end user devices, our computers, our smartphones, our streaming televisions, and so forth. And collectively, those three systems comprise the internet. And the internet, as we understand it, accounts for around, if we remove cryptocurrency from the equation, around 5% of global electricity use. So it's not a massive share of global electricity use, but it's also not a non-trivial one. Today, what I'm going to be talking about are data centers, because these have become a really hot topic thanks to the AI boom. So if you're reading the papers, listening to the news, you're probably hearing about a lot of data center projects from a lot of big companies that are being launched in different parts of the country. They can be quite large. And so I'm going to focus on data centers as really probably one of the most important parts of the internet from an environmental impact perspective. And here are some stories, right? So, pretty much every day now we're hearing in the news about AI's insatiable appetite for energy, about the growing water demand of data centers, about local air pollution considerations when data centers are built and are running on fossil fuel generation, even things like noise coming from data centers down the street. These are all issues that are now part of the public consciousness. But these are fairly recent. I've been looking at data centers for 20 years, and I say that if I stopped someone on the street 20 years ago and asked them what is a data center, most people wouldn't really know, or they'd have some vague idea, and they certainly wouldn't have an opinion about data centers. Not 20 years ago, right? These are always off in the background and fueling the internet, but we really weren't aware of them and didn't think much about them. That's changed with AI because AI is very compute intensive, and what it means is we need many large data centers, and there's been a big investment boom in the US. So today, most people understand what a data center is a bit better, and they certainly have an opinion about whether they're for or against or what the impacts might be. So to give you a sense of the rest of the presentation, I want to tell you a little bit about what I do on a day-to-day basis. So I'm in a field of research which is known as energy analysis. And what we do is we try to build models of energy consuming systems, number one, to understand how much energy different systems use and what drives that energy use. So questions that people like me get asked a lot are, number one, how much energy do data centers and AI currently use? How much carbon? How much water? Similar questions. The second question is, well, where is that energy or water use or carbon emissions? Where is that going in the future? What's the trajectory? Is it going to be growing very quickly? What are the implications for that growth on the grid, on the environment, and so forth? The third question we get asked is, well, what can we do about it? Are there technologies? Are there behaviors? Are there policies that can be deployed to bend the curve? And as you can imagine, answering these questions requires people like me to have lots of data, to build models, to work with uncertainty. And answering these questions from top to bottom requires more and more data, and the models we need to answer them become more and more complex, right? So we don't have perfect data, as I'll discuss, in terms of what the impacts are of the internet or data centers today. And it's very hard to predict where this system is going in the future because it's changing so rapidly. But we do have some reports that do deep dives into the topic. The most recent one, published by colleagues at Lawrence Berkeley National Lab, I was a co-author on this report, came out about a year ago. And I'll give you some of the results from this report, in which we try to do a very deep dive, use best available data to come up with best available estimates for the energy, water, and emissions of US data centers and where they may be going in the near term. So I'll show you some of those results. And you might say, well, why do we need models? Why don't we have the data already? Don't the data center operators have the data? The answer to that latter question is yes, the companies do have the data, but they don't necessarily share them publicly. So I hope this table isn't too small, but this is an article which came out a few months ago, which basically did a stock take of some environmental issues that we care about. So here in the first column, we see electricity consumption, we see emissions, we see water use, and in the columns, we see a bunch of different major data center operators around the world: Amazon, Meta, Google, the usual suspects. And, if you just scan the table, what you're going to see is a lot of no's. And what this table is doing is it's asking the question, does this company report on their electricity consumption publicly? Do they report on their emissions? Do they report on their water consumption? Some companies do, but a lot of companies don't. And what that means is we don't have empirical data, meaning true reported data from the sector. Currently, the US government doesn't collect these data either. And what it means is analysts like me have to make a lot of estimates using the best available data we can find and a lot of assumptions when we come up with the carbon implications, the water implications, the energy implications of the internet. Hopefully this is going to change in the future, but this is why we can't just go to the official statistics. They don't exist for this sector. And there are some challenges when we try to make these estimates. The first one is the growth of the sector in the United States. So this is a graph that's now, it's a little bit old. It was shared last year. The situation may even be a bit more stark today. But what are we looking at here? Well, first, we're going back to 2010 in this graph. And what the graph is plotting is the year of construction of data center capacity, which we generally measure in terms of the power requirements of the IT within a data center. So gigawatts, right? And you don't have to understand anything more than that to know that the data center power demand in the US is projected to grow very rapidly, because if you just go from left to right, what you see is that for many years, up until around 2022, 2023, this is when the so-called AI boom happened, this sector was fairly predictable, fairly regular in terms of the amount of data centers that were being built every year. It was a bit easier to analyze. Post 2022, what we're seeing is a huge spike in the number of data centers that are being announced and built and planned. Some of them are being stalled, but now we have to track a lot more data centers. So that's the first part of the challenge, is that it's a fast moving system that's difficult to track because it's moving so quickly. But the second part of that challenge is these data centers are getting very, very large. This is why we're hearing about them in the news all the time. So just to give you a sense of how large these data centers are getting, I'm going to show you the before time, so before the AI boom, and what we're seeing now after, or in the midst of the AI boom. So before the AI boom, this is a picture of a data center. This is a Facebook leased data center in Virginia. Its power capacity is around, or was around 70 megawatts. And just to translate that into more accessible terms, that's about the average power capacity in the grid that we need to meet the average demand of around 50,000 homes. These were among the largest data centers on the planet prior to AI. 70 megawatts, 100 megawatts, those are the largest ones you would find just 5 or 6 short years ago. With the AI boom, because AI computations require so much power, these data centers are becoming much larger. So what we're seeing here in this right-hand graph is planned data centers that for which construction has begun by some big companies, Meta, Microsoft, OpenAI, Anthropic, and the others, right? And what the graph is showing is their scale. So when they'll reach 1 gigawatt of power, and 1 gigawatt of power, that's 10 times the size of the largest data centers on the planet just 5 or 6 years ago. So what we're seeing is not only are we adding many more data centers, or we're planning to add many more data centers, each data center on average is a lot larger than they used to be. And in fact, these gigawatt scale data centers are 10 times the size of the largest data centers we had just 5 or 6 years ago. And they're not stopping at 1 gigawatt. We're seeing announcements of 2 gigawatts, 3 gigawatts, 4 gigawatts. This is why we're hearing about the power crunch of data centers. So this is also a challenge, is estimating when they'll be built. Will they be built to capacity? When will that load finally be realized? What will be the fuel sources, and so forth? The third part of the challenge relates to backlash that we're seeing across the US, and it's starting to play out in other parts of the world. It's mostly a US phenomenon for now. So you probably have heard that local communities are beginning to oppose data centers. And here are some news articles. Data Center Watch says that $64 billion worth of data center projects have been blocked or delayed. And this is because communities are becoming concerned about the emissions, the power, the water use, about their electricity bills. And what we're seeing in my lab, we track global policies for data centers. And what we're seeing here in this graph is sort of a snapshot from one of our recent data updates. This is already a little bit out of date because this graph is already a month old. But what are we seeing here? These are data center policies that are emerging in different parts of the world. The light blue here are policies that are being introduced at the state level. This is a very local level for policies to be introduced. And that's where we're seeing lots and lots of growth. And some of these policies are either putting up restrictions or sometimes even moratoria on data centers. And these are emerging rapidly. So also understanding what's the role of policy? Will these data centers be built? If they can't be built here, will they be built there? It makes the job a bit more complex, but we are seeing lots and lots of policy activity. And I'll circle back to this a bit later in the talk when I talk about what you might want to do if you're interested in advocating for more sustainable data centers. Fourth part of the challenge is you may have heard that these large data centers simply can't get enough power as soon as they want it. So a lot of these sites can't connect to the existing electricity grids. It doesn't always have to be due to the lack of power generation capacity. It often has to do with transmission and distribution, just not having the capacity to connect to the grid. In many parts of the country, data centers are waiting 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 years before they can connect to the grid. And so because of this, they're bypassing that altogether, and they're installing their own small power plants on site. This is a wonderful article from the New York Times. What we're seeing are data center sites around the country, large announced projects, some of them multiple gigawatts in scale. And the blue bubbles here are sites where they are installing their own power generation off the grid. So they're not waiting to connect to the grid. Rather, they're building and they're installing mostly small natural gas turbines on their data center sites behind the meter, we say, in order to power their own operations. A problem with this is, well, we don't always understand as analysts where these projects are going to occur, right? These have big implications for the emissions, but also these generators are generally less efficient than what you'd find on the grid, and they can cause hot pockets of local air pollution in the communities where data centers are located. And certainly from a carbon perspective, we want to be moving towards renewables and not towards on-site fossil fuels. So this is another challenge with the estimates. Almost done with challenges, but I want to give you a sense before I talk about numbers, where the numbers come from. A fifth challenge relates to the way that the tech industry is investing heavily in renewable projects and also potentially breakthrough energy technologies. So it must be said that the tech industry, the large data center operators, are among, or if not among, the largest investors in renewable energy on the planet. It's just that they may be investing in an on-site generator for their new data center in some part of the country. When they do that, they'll invest in a renewable project somewhere else. So what that means is on net, it's sometimes difficult to pin down the carbon emissions of the tech sector, because if they build fossil fuel capacity in one area or connect to fossil fuel capacity in one area, often they'll invest in renewable capacity to offset that from a climate perspective somewhere else, either in the same grid, maybe in the same country, maybe somewhere else in the world. And they're also investing in a lot of breakthrough technologies like enhanced geothermal energy for the future, or nuclear fusion down the line. So this complicates a lot of estimates of the carbon footprint of the internet, because these renewable investments are real, they're happening, and they are moving the needle towards more renewables in grids, perhaps not tied to their data centers, maybe somewhere else. The last part is IT equipment in general tends to get more efficient with every generation. So the perfect example of that is if we all have cell phones, and if you can think back to the early days of smartphones, we had to charge them a lot more often than we do today. And the functionality we got from those smartphones was a lot less than what we have today. So a smartphone today can do a lot more with a lot less power. And that's due to the fact that the computing chips, the memory, the storage, the algorithms, everything gets more efficient over time. So even the efficiency of the system is a moving target for analysts to pin down. And understanding all of these aspects is really important for putting out a reliable number on the energy use, the water use, the carbon emissions of data centers. And those numbers can change rapidly. So let me talk a little bit about where we see energy use headed. And I'm talking about energy use because the carbon emissions of data centers are intrinsically tied to their energy. There's a little bit of carbon emissions coming from refrigerants, I should say greenhouse gas emissions coming from refrigerants for coolants, that sort of thing. But it's the vast majority of carbon emissions come from the fuels used for electricity to power data centers. So in the United States, a couple of marquee graphics from our report that came out about a year ago are shown on this slide. If we start on the top, what we can see there is this is the projected national level electricity use of data centers in the United States. And as I mentioned, a decade or so ago, this was a fairly predictable sector where energy use was always going up, but pretty slowly compared to what we're seeing in the AI boom. Around 2020 or 2021, when AI investments really started ramping up, the trajectory of energy use, or I should say electricity use in the US, also ramped up. And what our latest estimate is that in 2023, US data centers demanded about 4.5% of total US electricity use, but that share is likely to go up under different scenarios, anywhere from 6.7% to 12% by 2028. And that's really rapid growth. The bottom graph really gets at why that growth is happening. So what are we looking at in the bottom graph? This shows the share of that electricity use that's attributable to different types of data centers. If we go to the far left and look at 2010, back then, most data centers were what we would call internal data centers that were operated by companies that needed data centers. So, my campus has several data centers. Wells Fargo, your bank, they have several data centers and so forth. Moving forward into the present day and off into the future, most data centers are being operated by what we call the hyperscale operators, Meta, Microsoft, Amazon, Google, and so forth, and large colocation data centers that'll be hosting AI. So the implications here are most of the growth that we're predicting is really concentrated in the largest data centers that are being operated by a relatively small number of companies compared to the past. So that's a big shift compared to where data centers used to be in the country about 10 years ago. In terms of carbon emissions, it can be difficult to estimate the carbon emissions of data centers for all the reasons that I mentioned on the previous slides. But the International Energy Agency has attempted to do this at the global level. So they have a report, it's publicly available, you can check it out, it's very well researched, where they are projecting the global energy mix to their best ability of data centers. And what we can see is on this left-hand graph, there still will be quite a bit of reliance on fossil fuels, coal and natural gas, but there will be a lot of uptake, they think, in terms of renewables. And what that means is that energy demands of data centers will continue to grow. But in terms of carbon emissions, if they're able to shift to more renewables, as suggested by the IEA's analysis, what that might mean is that carbon emissions might continue to go up, and then they'll peak and roughly plateau in the latter half of the next decade due to more renewables adoption. We don't know if this is going to happen. Trends are pointing to more fossil fuel use in the United States right now. But just to give you a sense of scale, this is about 1% of global greenhouse gas emissions from the energy system, even a bit less than that. So is it significant? Yes. Is it a massive quantity that has no end in sight in terms of its growth? This is not what analysts are seeing. That's not to say that there aren't a lot of other issues that we should care about for data centers, like noise, like local pollution, like rising energy prices, like water, and so forth. But this is the best available estimate right now for the carbon emissions of the global internet. And why is global important? Well, anytime you get on the internet and you send an email, or you buy something, or you check your balance in your bank account, whatever that activity may be, there's no telling where that data center is that's hosting that particular set of computations. It could be, one down the block from you, or it could be one in the UK, depending on, where the services are being provided. So when it comes to understanding the carbon implications of the internet, we really often have to take a global perspective because it is a global system. All right. I also want to comment on another issue that I know a lot of people are concerned about, which is water consumption. So data centers use water often to cool the racks and the servers, which generate a lot of heat. They use cooling towers, which evaporate water to reject that heat from the data center. So you're probably hearing a lot of stories about data centers causing water stress or using lots of water at local scales, and that can be certainly true. At the level of the country, our most recent analyses suggest that water demand by data centers will certainly grow under different scenarios moving forward, and could reach as high as around 300 billion liters per year. Now, this is where there's a lot of debate. So one perspective is, okay, 300 billion liters is a lot of water. There's no doubt about that. But at the national level, one could compare that to about the water consumption of 1 day of U.S. crop irrigation. So there are critics of the water debate who say, if you look at the scale of it, it's pretty small compared to a lot of other things. I personally think that's the wrong way to look at water, because water is a very local issue. Location really matters. If you're in a location where you have plenty of water and the local community is fine with the amount of water being used by the data center, perhaps it's no problem. However, what we're seeing is there are a lot of places where water is stressed. So the fact that national water use in total amounts to only 1 day of irrigation for all of our crops is no consolation to people living around a data center in Phoenix, for example, where they're under water stress, right? And this is where we're seeing a lot of pushback from communities because total water may be small, but when you take it down to the level of your local data center, that could be a really large quantity causing a lot of problems at the local scale, and communities have every right to push back against water. And you'll see this dynamic a lot. If you look at the big numbers, data centers, internet, the impact seems small, but if you drill down to the local level where people are affected, they can be quite large. Okay, so the last thing I'd like to talk about, which I think we'll have to extend into the Q&A, is talking about our own personal carbon, water, energy footprint of the internet or AI or whatever digital service you may have in mind. And we're sort of conditioned and expecting to get carbon footprints for anything that we do. One example here that I've just pulled relates to food, right? So we probably all heard about our personal carbon footprint, and consuming one hamburger of beef, as we can see here, relates to, I think this is a kilogram of beef, so that'd be a very large hamburger. Sorry, 1 kilogram of beef is about 22 kilograms of CO2. But if you switch to veggie burgers, you're going to drop the carbon footprint of that consumption by a healthy fraction down to 3.74, right? So these can be very useful sorts of numbers for guiding our day-to-day decisions. And for systems like the food system, or the amount of embodied carbon in our vehicles or in our homes, these are systems that don't change very rapidly, and it's possible to come up with reasonably accurate carbon footprint values. For this audience, what we're talking about today is the internet and digital services. And so because we're so used to seeing carbon footprint numbers for many other things that we care about, why shouldn't we have them for things like a streaming video? What's the carbon footprint of that? Or an email or a search query? Or now we're talking about an AI model query. It seems natural that we should be able to make such calculations for internet services as well. And if we have that information, the theory is we can make better decisions. So let me tell you about how these estimates come together, and I'm happy to talk about this more in the Q&A. The first is if you just do a simple search of what is the carbon footprint of an email or a Google search or a ChatGPT query, or you put water or you put energy in there, what you're going to find is there is a wide range of estimates that are floating out there, some from the academic literature, some from blogs, some from companies, right? And they all differ. So here I've just pulled a few. I could have populated this with 100 more examples about the water footprint of ChatGPT. The little quote there is 10 to 50. Using the chatbot for between 10 to 50 queries consumes about 2 liters of water. Or an email up here is about 0.03 grams of carbon emissions, right? Or maybe you heard that using Google for one search is equivalent energy of boiling 1 kettle of tea. That's a very old number, but these things tend to stick around. The challenge for you as a consumer is these numbers are so varied and they differ by so much. What is the right number? And this is a hard question to answer. So let me use an analogy just so we're all on the same page about how such estimates are made. And what I'm going to do is use an analogy from personal transport, which is something we're all familiar with. So what are we looking at here? This is a wonderful graph from a colleague of mine back from my grad school days, Mike Chester. And what he did was he calculated the carbon footprint of different forms of passenger transit. So we can see a whole bunch of familiar options here: gasoline sedan, an SUV, a diesel bus, light rail, aircraft, and so forth. And what he did was he looked at the full life cycle footprint, so making the vehicle, making the roadways, consuming the fuel, and so forth. And what this graph shows is the greenhouse gas emissions per passenger kilometer traveled. So what these metrics do, they're very similar to the carbon footprint of a hamburger. Is the way we calculate them is we figure out the total impacts of the overall system. In this case, it's different ways of personal, getting around, our personal transit choices, right? So we try to calculate the total impact, whatever that is: water, energy, carbon emissions, and then we divide that by the total activity. And in this case, it is the greenhouse gas emissions divided by the passenger kilometers for each mode. And what I'd love to do here, and you can see already there's a big difference in the greenhouse gas footprint of a passenger kilometer, meaning how you or I could move 1 kilometer. Our choice for the transit mode is going to affect our carbon footprint. I'd like to show you, this example here using a bus from my hometown of Chicago. Here we can see there are 2 different estimates for the carbon footprint of an urban diesel bus. And right away you can see that there's almost a tenfold, not quite a tenfold, maybe an 8-fold difference in these estimates. What's the difference here? So if you read the fine print here, the top one, which has a high greenhouse gas footprint per passenger kilometer, this is an off-peak bus. So imagine, you work the 3rd shift, you're coming home at night on the bus, and you're sitting on the bus with the bus driver. And that's it, right? That means all the impacts of that trip are divided by you and the bus driver, or probably just you. So you have a really high greenhouse gas footprint. Contrast that with, let's say, you're in the morning commute every morning, rush hour, and you're packed to the gills on that bus. Suddenly, all the impacts of that bus are now being divided by a lot more passengers. So what that means is your personal share of the carbon footprint is much lower. And this is the same problem we have with the internet. So, the key variables here are how large is the bus, right? That will drive the overall impacts of the bus. How many passengers could it fit? How many passengers are on it when you measured it? How fuel efficient is the bus? So if you're in an old bus, it's going to use a lot more fuel. If you're in a new bus, it's going to use a lot less fuel. What type of fuel is it? If we're thinking about carbon emissions, it matters if it's diesel fuel, maybe it's biodiesel, maybe it's hydrogen, maybe it's an electric bus. The choice of the bus matters in these metrics as well. And then, of course, which life cycle stages are included? Are we including the manufacturing of the bus? Are we including the bus terminals? Are we including the roadway and the share of the roadway that is applicable to your trip, right? These are all questions that we need to ask. And the analogy for the internet would be, how many queries are we assuming that a model could handle? What's the energy mix of the internet? What is the efficiency associated with that metric? All the things I mentioned about trying to calculate the impacts of the internet are changing so rapidly that the numerator is really hard to pin down. And then the denominator is, how many uses do we divide all those impacts by so that I know that one query amounted to X kilograms of carbon or Y liters of water can be really tricky. And that's why you're seeing such great variation in all of the per activity numbers that are out there, which, we're counting on to drive our decisions. There are some efforts I would highly recommend that if people are concerned about different AI models and the energy implications of those models, to take a look at this website. It's produced by Hugging Face in a large collaboration, but they've come up with a way to sort of benchmark the energy intensities of different types of AI models, so you get a sense of the energy requirements for 1,000 queries. Their methodology is well documented. Their data are collected in a very rigorous way. It's a pretty good scorecard. And what you can do from that is, what you can tell, the way I recommend you use these sorts of scorecards is not so much to place a huge amount of confidence that, the GPU energy watt hours is precisely 1.31. But what you can see here is this model here has half the energy footprint of this model to help it drive decisions towards the models that in general are the least energy intensive and the most efficient. That's the best use of these sorts of scorecards, rather than potentially saying, well, this amount is equivalent to 1 burger, right? So I'll skip the burger today so I can have an extra query or something like that. What I recommend everyone to do is to perhaps not just think about the impact per query, but to get back to the numerator of that metric. And the numerator is the total impact of the companies that make the models and whose models that we would use, or the services that we would use. And we know a lot about what would make the internet more sustainable. And I've got really a few conditions here, which I'll just go over briefly before we turn it over to Q&A. So the first is that different AI models well, I should say, let me start over. AI models vary a lot in terms of their efficiency, as we saw in the previous slide. So you want to look for the most efficient models using scorecards like that. And we want to be looking for smaller models for specific tasks. We don't need the gigantic LLMs to do everything that machine learning or AI can do, right? The second thing is we should be looking for data centers that are sited so that they can maximize their use of renewables and minimize water stress. So if a company is siting their data centers in areas where they can meet those two conditions, then naturally the extension is that ideally their models, their internet services would have lower carbon and lower water footprints. And thankfully, this information is becoming more and more publicly available. The third is we want to hold these data centers to a strict account in terms of their efficiency. So we do have measures of data center efficiency. There are a few metrics that are there that are often publicly reported. So we want to look for companies that have very low PUE values. This is a measure of their cooling system efficiency. In this respect, low is good, or WE, a low value is better, right? We need to push them to be more transparent to report those numbers. But if they're more efficient, we can have confidence that the services are probably lower impact. The fourth is that data centers now have an opportunity to reuse waste heat from the servers. They don't necessarily have to reject that heat into the environment. So we should be looking for data center operators that are maximizing waste heat recovery and recycling that heat for neighboring buildings or industrial projects. The fifth is companies can do a lot to minimize their impacts on the grid and to maximize the amount of renewables by doing things like installing on-site battery storage to use renewable power when they can, and then run on their batteries when renewable power isn't available for those short periods. We can look for that. The last three really relate to companies being a lot more transparent. And this is something that I've been pushing for and others in the field have been pushing for a long time. We need operators to report more data so that the research community, policymakers, and local communities can understand their impacts, hold them to account, track their progress over time. So companies that are being more transparent in their impacts, there are some that are better than others, and that are measuring and reporting the impacts of their services are the ones that we want to be promoting and moving away from the ones that are being non-transparent and really not sharing this sort of information with the world. And that will allow consumers to choose wisely. The last thing I'll say before I wrap up is there is a real opportunity for any community member to get engaged in the local political process. So there are policies being proposed at the county level, at the state level, at the national level sometimes, that will try to enforce more sustainability guardrails on data center operators and also require them to be a lot more transparent. And this is where your voice can be heard. And the purpose of reshowing this graph is just to reinforce that this activity is happening all around the country at a lot of different levels, local governments, federal government, state government, and so forth, where you can get involved to really press for the policies that are going to put up these guardrails and drive the industry towards more sustainable pathways. Because right now, I would argue that in our observation, that we're not headed on the right path when it comes to carbon, energy, and water. And this is a way for individuals to really let their voice be heard and to potentially have great leverage over the future of data centers in this country. And with that, I'd like to wrap up. Sorry if I went a little long. There's a lot to cover, but I'd be more than happy to answer your questions.
Thanks so much, Eric. We're going to move into the Q&A now. We have a bit of time. We'll be going till 1:30 today. So if folks want to raise their digital hand, I can call on you, and then you can come off mute and give your question. And then, Eric, do you mind taking down your slides for
Sure.
a moment? Does anyone have any questions? Steve, go for it.
Oh, I had to unmute myself. Well, this is unbelievably depressing. We all know this is a really difficult situation. So thank you for your analysis. I guess one question I have is there's a lot of discussion about carbon and greenhouse gas, but obviously there's more greenhouse gas impacts than just carbon that come from, energy. So I'm assuming that you're really focused on greenhouse gas. Carbon is obviously the big elephant in the room, but there's more elephants in the room. Has this included a broader perspective on different kinds of emissions beyond just carbon and the impacts. That's number one. Number two is, there might be some additional issues around health and safety with emissions, and this might be something to be included. I'm sure that this is kind of opposition that's coming, might be because of we don't want to see a power plant, not just because of greenhouse gas, but because it's emitting particulate matter, that a lot of health issues that go beyond greenhouse gas and climate. Okay, those are two things. Just great presentation. Thank you.
Thanks, Stephen. Thanks for the wonderful questions. And you're right. These are two nuances that are really important, which I'll try to address concisely, and sort of hard to get into those weeds at a very high level. But you're absolutely right. The first one, greenhouse gases. Let's be clear that greenhouse gases include more than just CO2, which we often sort of shorthand to carbon, right? So methane is an important and potent greenhouse gas that has a lot more greenhouse gas, let's say, global warming potential, radiative forcing than just a molecule of CO2. So yes, methane leaks can occur in the natural gas distribution system. We're well aware of that. And we're starting to use a lot more natural gas to power these data centers, these big new builds, because most of the generation that's being installed on site to bypass the grid is natural gas. So if you include those methane emissions and you tack that on top of just the combustion related emissions of burning natural gas into CO2, the footprint would increase from a greenhouse gas perspective. But as I hinted at, there's also refrigeration or refrigerants that are used in water chillers that are used for cooling. Those are also very potent global warming gases. And if you include potential leakages or that sort of thing from refrigerants, the carbon footprint would be even higher. So yes, we should be careful about terminology. And unfortunately, adding in those additional greenhouse gas emissions means the carbon equivalent footprint is only going to go up. The second aspect is a really important one. So there are more emissions that we're concerned about than just greenhouse gas emissions. And you hinted at some of them. This would be local air pollutants from combusting. Any fuel we combust is going to lead to air pollution. The type of pollution really depends on the fuel. For natural gas, we're looking at nitrous NOx, which is a smog forming compound. There could be also volatile organic compounds, which are no good for human health. And the issue is, if we're powering data centers with many smaller natural gas turbines distributed around the country, we're starting to spread that pollution out, especially if local communities are located nearby. Absolutely, they would be exposed to more local air pollution from those generators. And this is a topic that researchers are beginning to study. I've seen some estimates of the air pollution footprint, and it's something we need to study a lot better because these have very real effects on local communities on the ground next door to their data centers.
I see there are some questions in the chat, but just a reminder, we're going to be prioritizing those who raise their hands, come off mute, and ask their questions. So, Natalie, you want to go ahead next?
That's great. Thank you so much, Eric. I really enjoyed the presentation. My question is, what can a responsibly minded organization do to reduce their impact on this problem?
Yeah, it's a great question. So if we step back to the internet overall, so your organization, you're going to have a lot of computers and maybe on-site sort of data center operations that have to interact with the grid. Make those as efficient as possible, right? Buy the most efficient equipment. Make sure, equipment's powered down. Make sure it's Energy Star certified, because we can't forget that in that first graph, roughly a third of the footprint, whether it be energy or carbon or whatever, of the internet relates to our end user devices, which there are many of, right? So responsible use there is the first step. The second thing is, as organizations tend to contract with, an internet company, Gmail or OneDrive or whatever. So in procurement contracts, you can often specify that you're going to only contract with companies that comply with a set of criteria, and you could make those criteria about being more transparent or using renewable energy or just disclosing how much water you use. There are some companies that do a better job of those things than others, and that might give you some choice in whom you contract with. But even in your personal life, we have a whole range of models that we can use in our daily lives. And if you find that AI is useful, especially like the large language models, generative AI, for whatever reason, you can use the AI scorecard. You can look to papers like the ones that I have in my presentation, and you can pretty quickly identify companies that are doing more of the good things and less of the bad things as an organization. And chances are, if you steer your traffic towards those models and those services, you can't really, it's a massive global ship, right? That's very hard to steer quickly, but you can put the power of, your decisions, your dollars, your internet activity towards, promoting the companies that are doing a better job and away from the companies that are doing a worse job. And that's another thing that individuals can do. And, if you want to use AI less, you want to use your devices less, I think that's good from a mental health perspective anyway. That's something else. I'm not sure yet if that's going to stop this big machine, just because there's so much investment happening now in these large data centers. I think it's going to take a while before the business case shakes out, and we see some of the data centers not be fully built or not built at all. But in the meantime, sure, ramping back might help you reduce your own footprint and maybe get offline, which I think is even better.
Thank you so much.
Scott, then Stephen.
Yeah. I mean, besides seeing a bubble like we did in 1999, where the internet got so large and everybody crashed, that we're probably not going to need all these data centers. My question is, I've done a lot of engineering work. These ones that have local generation, how are they getting their emissions permits?
Yeah.
Those are really difficult to get. I've had manufacturers literally not be able to open because they can't get their emissions permits. I've had universities that I try to renew them and they go, well, you're over the limit. And these guys are essentially putting a 500 megawatt power plant in some place, and the emissions to get the emissions permit is a 5 to 10 year process.
Yeah.
But that doesn't seem to be affecting this sector at all.
It's a great question. And I have to say right off the bat, I don't study at that level of detail, sort of how long the permits are taking. But what I can say is that there are places that are more friendly to streamline permitting processes than others in the country. By looking at the policies that are popping up all around the country, we're seeing kind of a bifurcation. There are jurisdictions where they're putting tighter guardrails on data centers in terms of transparency, required technologies, potential on-site generation fuels that they can and can't use, that sort of thing, and places that are doing the exact opposite and attracting data centers to communities and local grids and streamlining those processes. So I'm sure there's some work out there that has dived in a bit deeper than that very high level answer to you, Scott, but that's got to be what's playing out, because what we are seeing is in some places they can install on-site generation, they can run their, the backup generators more often, they can get connected faster than in other places. And I think it has to do with streamlining and incentives that are happening in those places. But that's a challenge for us as analysts, because studying this sector, we really want to know how many data centers are being planned and announced, where will they be, and tracking in real time where they're moving to and what different forms they take, because they can't build here, but now they're building there, is kind of a full-time job. But I suspect we're just seeing more streamlined, easier permitting processes in places where these on-site generators are appearing.
Yeah, I mean, most of the permitting I do at this level is not state, it's a federal permitting process. Of course, we're weak now, but these guys started a couple of years ago, if they're building them now. So at that point, they were strong. Thank you.
I wish I had a better answer for you.
Eric, I guess I'm next in the queue. I was kind of taken aback by your chart of passenger emissions per mile per kilogram.
Mhm.
So I've been feeling guilty. So instead of flying, I've been driving. Now, is that totally the wrong thing to do? It looks like it from your chart. And doesn't matter if I'm driving an electric vehicle.
It absolutely matters if you're driving an electric vehicle. And remember, that chart it was wonderful work. It's a bit old now. It's nearly 15 years old, but it's a wonderful chart because it kind of shows the big picture differences. But again, all of those estimates, they're a product of two things, right? What you put in the numerator and what you put in the denominator. So if you have a really, a packed plane, packed to the gills, so that's a modern plane, very efficient, you're going to find that it has a lower energy per passenger kilometer footprint versus an older jet where it's operating at half capacity. Your personal vehicle, it's the same kind of dynamic. If you're a single passenger in a relatively fuel inefficient, let's say SUV, sure, there are instances where maybe that greenhouse gas footprint could be worse than flying on a super efficient jet that's packed to the gills, right? So I would say electrification makes a lot of sense for passenger vehicles from a carbon perspective. Even from an energy perspective, EVs are just a lot more energy efficient because you don't have all the friction and heat losses that you do in an internal combustion engine. And you can pretty much ignore kind of the old trope that's out there that an EV is worse than a gasoline vehicle because of the grid, right? There are probably a few places where you have a very coal intensive grid and maybe an inefficient EV where that's still true. But by and large, researchers, I think, have found that, in most cases, EVs are pretty much a slam dunk, even given some fairly dirty grids today, just because they're more efficient. So you shouldn't feel guilty about riding in your EV. And if you can have multiple passengers in there to spread that impact out over more service in the denominator, that's always the best way to go.
Thank you.
So I think I'm up next. Thank you. It's a great talk and really appreciate the approach. Going back to the siting of data centers and potential policy advocacy, not only at the town level, but for example, state level. So like some other people here, I'm in 350 Mass, who recently have been talking about, should we get a basic position that we can use for advocacy when the opportunity arise regarding siting? And we come up with a bunch of basic points, but we don't, certainly not experts. Is there any place you're aware of where someone has sort of come up with a set of demands other than moratorium? Well, that'd be a second question, like where does moratorium fit in? That captures some of the things that you mentioned, which we're not so expert on. Obviously you maybe can't be super hyper specific, that gets to local permitting, but how would you phrase the demand for, trying to minimize energy use or water use or whatever? Has anybody come up? Have you aware of any models or sets you might recommend that we could look to?
Hey,
Well, there's
Eric, this is Fred jumping in, just reminding folks that we'll be able to continue this conversation up to 1:30 if you're available, as folks would like. But if folks have to drop in the next couple of minutes at the end of the hour, we really appreciate everyone being here. It's been a fantastic discussion. Let's keep it going. And sorry to interrupt.
No worries, Fred. That's important. So, and I'm happy to stick around for the next 30 minutes because it's a topic that I really enjoy, and I think there's a lot of appetite for learning more about. So, Paul, really great point. So that graph that I showed at the very end of my presentation is a visualization from a policy tracking database that we maintain here at UCSB, and we're about to release publicly. So what we're seeing is, for the longest time, it was fairly easy to track data center policies because there weren't that many. And in the last 2 years, there's been an explosion of policies where it's almost impossible to keep up. My students, for them to keep up. Nearly every day, we're seeing a policy proposal here and another one there. And there's a wide range of policy levers that are being incorporated in different sorts of policy proposals. Some are really trying to attract data centers, giving tax breaks and incentives. Others are at the other end of the spectrum where it's an outright ban or moratorium. And some are somewhere in between. But here's what I would say. My thought on the matter is, I think communities should be armed with the best information they have, whether that's a local community or a state or a county, whatever the level of jurisdiction is, so that they can make the best decisions for, their own needs. I mean, there is an argument that that data centers can be a good form of tax revenue, and there's some level of employment, especially with construction and that sort of thing, right? And that's why some states are trying to attract data centers. But on the other hand, it's really difficult to advocate for really strong policies that balance everything you're concerned with if we don't have the transparency and the data. So to take a step back, if you had to design like the most sustainable data center, here's what I would look for. I would look for one that has maximal energy efficiency. So this means, PUE, WE, this is energy and water efficiency. These are metrics that data centers should report. They can all measure them. Make them as low as possible as a requirement. That's one thing that communities could do. The second thing is to make sure that they're being responsible stewards of water. So if there's water stress, then perhaps data centers shouldn't be using water in their cooling strategies. They should be using other technologies that you can look for. However, if you have a lot of water resources, you still want to protect them. You just want to make sure that it's water efficient. You want to make sure that if data centers are coming to town, that they ideally can be connected to renewable energy, or at minimum, maybe that they can have on-site battery storage or some other form of electricity storage, let's call it, to be simple, so that they can help the grid take on more renewables, use renewable energy when it's available, avoid energy use when it's not, that sort of thing. They should have commitments to go 100% renewable or to offset that somewhere else. They should be recovering the waste heat and using it in a way that's going to benefit maybe the local office building or aquaculture or whatever. So what I'm painting for you is this laundry list of the best practices that would make for the most sustainable data center. And if those best practices can be met by requiring them in legislation and the community is okay with those best practices, then that's where effective policy can come in, I think. And it's up to the communities. So maybe communities don't want data centers because of the noise or because of the, the land or the visual blight, whatever, that's up to them. But it's really difficult to craft well-balanced policies that can really push the industry to these optima without having that information. So what I would say is, just to wrap that up, like there is a checklist of things that you can look for, and there are communities. So I've seen surveys that say that people aren't necessarily opposed to data centers everywhere, but they want them to be sustainable and renewable, right? And if that's the local community's goal, then you should have the data and the let's say that laundry list of things that have to be met in order for that data center bill to proceed. That's where I say communities should be looking. But if they want to have a moratorium until data centers can prove that they're doing those things, that's great. I'm behind those sorts of things as well, to really push the industry to be more proactive and more transparent. And if they want to ban them, that's up to them, right? But we're in a situation now where we don't have full information as citizens to make those decisions and to balance all of those factors: economic, tax revenue, environmental protection, jobs, whatever it may be, to make the right decisions. And that's got to change. And if you want to follow up, Paul, like we could query our data set to see all those things that I just mentioned are playing out in different policies around the country. It's just hard on the spot to think of one place that's doing everything in one way versus another way. But there are examples out there, and we track them. Oh, you're still on mute, Paul.
You don't have to respond further now. I appreciate that invitation for follow-up, because my approach was from, if you want to take a state policy approach that focused on sustainability, not unfairly burdening the grid, the ratepayers, the locals, would be the appropriate demand set. So I guess it sounds like you might be able to extract some best practices from the constellation of examples that are out there.
We can extract sort of, different degrees of ambition.
Yeah, right.
And it's still an experiment, right? Which policies will pass? So policies often start out very ambitious, and then whatever comes out the other end of the legislative process can sometimes eat water down or not pass at all. So we're watching to see what's going to be most effective, but I can certainly share examples of any combination of all those factors, because we're seeing everything. It's a bit of a grab bag because policymakers want to react quickly, but they're not always armed with the history of what works and what doesn't work and the data that they need to have really finely tuned policies. So it's an important trend to watch for sure. I think Caroline or Carolyn.
Hi. Caroline Murray. I'm with Turner, so I work for the contractor that's building a lot of these data centers. So awesome presentation. It's the most complete one I've seen on this topic yet. So thank you for that. I agree with the earlier commenter that it is a little depressing, but I do appreciate the nuance that you're providing. And I wanted to say, like, the operation of the data center is bad, but there's also the construction process, which is also bad. You know, a lot of material, a lot of carbon, a lot of waste, a lot of water for that. But I will say that we are doing better, and these clients, you know, the ones you mentioned, are the ones pushing climate tech. They're the only ones. It's not coming from the federal government. It's not coming from private landowners. So whether they're doing it for their headline or they're doing it because they're investing in some of these novel companies or whatever, it doesn't matter. So that does, you know, for everybody on the call, that should make you feel a little bit better. Not great, but better. My question, and I think some other question askers touched on this, we had that slide with the map and the blue bubbles and who was providing their own energy on their side of the meter. Like, is it naive to think we'll just provide your own renewable for your own dang data center and that's the answer? And if it is that simple, then why not? Is it cost? Is it like the physical geography of the space? Is it permitting? Because I've heard, you know, and you don't know if what you hear is true, that there was, you know, Elon Musk was going to provide all solar panels for his data centers, and then with the administration, he changed the mind. So I don't know what's true. Could you just settle that once and for all, please?
Sure. I don't know if I can settle it, but Carolyn, you raised some really good points, and that is, I think I alluded to this as well. This is a sector that it's really hard to pin down, because on the one hand, sure, they're building as fast as they can with whatever power they can get, and it is moving us at least temporarily in the wrong direction, but they are the largest investors on the planet, because they're the richest sector on the planet as well, in renewable and breakthrough energy projects. So it's not all bad. But the other thing you mentioned is the building itself. So we could certainly, there was an earlier question about what could organizations do, and I mentioned sort of a checklist of procurement items, whether you go with company X or Y. We could also look to the construction of the site. Are they using, you know, green concrete and recycled steel? Those are other areas where they have some impact for sure. But back to the point of renewables. So that article, I think everyone should read it, just because it's quite interesting, because there had to be some sort of like proactive journalism, investigative journalism behind that article, because the companies aren't necessarily announcing publicly we're going to use, you know, on-site natural gas here, right? You kind of have to dig into permits and other documents to find that information. And those bubbles aren't necessarily existing capacity today. This is, I believe, planned capacity. So back to the earlier question about permitting, you know, how is that happening? It could be that not all those projects will be able to go forward, that some of them are planned. Those details are in the article. The reason it's difficult to just build renewable capacity on site, number one, is you're right, we have the technologies, but you know, there are better places for solar in the country, like Texas, absolutely, and wind, absolutely, in Texas. Why don't we build more solar and wind there? Partly it's because these data centers are really large, like a gigawatt scale data center. You know, if we go back to that example of the biggest data centers on the planet before, would use as much power as, I don't know, 70, 100,000 US homes. Now we're talking about 1 million US homes worth of power in a pretty small area. You need a lot of land area for that, for wind or for solar. And it's just faster and cheaper for them, I think, to use fossil fuels and to get on-site generators to get the initial build up and running. And we kind of have to remember, for better or worse, this is like an arms race, a gold rush, whatever you want to call it. There's huge amounts of investments in AI in these data centers, because these companies are all jockeying for competitive advantage. They don't want to be left behind. There are sort of national security concerns and US competitiveness undercurrents to all these builds as well. And so they just want to build as quickly as they can. It could be that they could eventually shift over to renewables, maybe even locally or closer to on-site, if they have the renewable resources there and they have the land and they've got the developers, and we should hold them to account, right? So maybe we can't stop them from getting permitted and running natural gas in the short term. Maybe we can, who knows? But we should hold them to account to switch to renewables in some way or another as quickly as possible. So what it usually means for these very large data center builds is they have to have really high capacity renewables. And so solar and wind can do it, but it takes time and it can't be done everywhere. That's why they're looking into geothermal. So enhanced geothermal is sort of the future of geothermal. It takes fracking technology, which we've used for gas and oil in this country for a long time, and getting down very deep down to very hot rocks where you can tap that power, a lot of it, or that energy, a lot of it, and then use it for geothermal power on site. Google has done this with Fervo Energy, and a few others are looking into enhanced geothermal. It's just that those projects will take time and they don't want to wait. And then the other thing that the industry is doing is they're banking a lot on nuclear. Two varieties. Fission is what we've been using for eons, right, or decades, I guess. They're looking to have small modular reactors or smaller plants. Microsoft is reviving 3 Mile Island and so forth because nuclear power is pretty cheap after you build it, right? And you can generate a lot of power quickly from it, big base load. But they're also looking into fusion, which would be, hopefully much greener. We don't quite know because fusion is going to come with its own issues potentially, but they're banking on fusion as this endless supply of energy. So they're hedging all these bets and doing all these things to sort of stay true to their net zero commitments. But the simplest answer after that long answer was they want to build as quickly as possible. And the quickest thing for them to do is to install on-site generation using fossil fuels. And we need to hold them to account and hopefully get them to switch to renewables as soon as we can. Yeah, that's my take on what's happening on the ground.
Okay, this is Fred. I put my hand up for I've been thinking about a high-level question here, Eric. And by the way, just before I'm doing this, I think everybody, if you didn't have a headache before this session, oh my goodness. So here's how I think of this high level question. The last 10 years, let's say, more or less, I see 3 arenas that have risen up, basically didn't exist more than 10 years ago, or if they did, they were at the low levels, for instance, that you talked about data centers. But those are crypto, which understandably is a separate subject. Another separate subject is indoor cannabis, legal indoor cannabis production, which is, and we don't usually talk about it, but that's unbelievably electricity intensive because of the lighting that's used. That's indoor cannabis production. And the third one is AI that you've been talking about. So what do they all 3 have in common? It seems to me is an economic model that business people looked at one end of it and said, oh my goodness, all these 3 things need is a whole lot of electricity. And somebody at that end of that business end of the decision making says, there's unlimited electricity available. All you have to do is ask for it and you'll get it and pay for it, obviously. But the payment is cheap. Somehow electricity has been deemed cheap enough to for gigawatts to be no big deal. And by the way, nobody's checking with me, the consumer, whether I really want to pay anything for AI at all, whether I want to pay for indoor production of cannabis versus outdoor under the zero cost sunlight, or whether I care about crypto. Nobody's asking me, the consumer, or anybody else on this call, would you like to pay for this? So there's weird economics going on here at a mega scale. And they're walloping us, and us being consumers, certainly, but the planet. So all that, and let's form a question out of that. And can you give an opinion about pricing carbon?
Yeah.
And thanks for
yeah. Because the theory is if you make any form of energy, and here we're talking about electricity, a lot more expensive because you put a price on that externality, one being carbon, but there are a lot of others, human health impacts, that sort of thing, right? Sort of the prices will drive the behavior because suddenly fossil fueled electricity will become a lot more expensive and either we won't use it or we'll use it a lot more efficiently or more sparingly. In general, a lot of us in the climate mitigation community have been, proponents of a carbon tax like that for a long time. It doesn't play out across the board where you need it to, in the US in particular, right? There are places in the world that have carbon taxes or carbon prices. And in California, we have carbon markets and that sort of thing. You're right. Economically, the theory is that would efficiently kind of solve the problem, because it would take something that's fairly cheap and make it a lot more expensive, because you'd bear the price of all those externalities. So I'm in favor. Whether we'll ever see that sort of federally in the United States is another question. But that would be, I think, a broad brush solution that would take care of a lot of problems. And I should put in a plug for my colleague from Lawrence Berkeley Lab. His name is Evan Mills. He studied the energy intensity of the cannabis industry. So Evan Mills, just Google his name and you can kind of see, the scale of it, the drivers. Crypto is another big issue. You saw that in my initial slide. I kind of brush it to the side because it wasn't the topic today. But yeah, that's enormously electricity intensive, and that's kind of by design when it comes to Bitcoin and other proof of work cryptocurrencies. And it's clear there that the people who benefit are very few, the ones who invest and hype up Bitcoin and make money off it, versus the rest of us who might have to deal with the grid consequences of it. So the inequities there are quite large.
So Eric, I do need to follow up. Thank you very much for that answer. So Evan Mills, the world's expert on the energy and climate impacts of cannabis, is an old buddy of mine. We go back 25 years at least. Okay. And we've talked about having him come and speak to MCAN, which would be terrific. He came out with a major new paper a year ago. Mm-hmm. And the reason we haven't, it's too depressing. Huh? So I think we will, and people can put in their druthers if they'd like to hear about how depressing cannabis can be. Again, it's indoor production versus outdoor production. Sure. If you grow your own, fantastic. And there is outdoor production commercially available in Massachusetts, and hardly anybody knows about it. And that alone is a good reason, is an argument in favor of having such a program. All right, sure. But I think you make a good case for, what do you call it, sanity in policy. So carbon pricing would be, what do you call it, sane. And maybe we should have sessions on that. And that actually is, I'm not kidding about that, because there's some great high-level policy people who are talking about when sanity comes back to Washington, D.C., should it look like what it used to look like? And since, unfortunately, so much has been destroyed, does it need to be the same, or should it be even more purposefully constructed? Sane policy in Washington, for instance, the Environmental Protection Agency, is that the best way to further heat pumps in Roslindale? I'm just making stuff up here, but there may be even better ways to effect sane policy in a sane era. We can look forward to that.
Yeah, I think I'd make for a wonderful webinar. I should also add, and I don't want to expand the discussion space too greatly, but the sort of elephant in the room is, AI. First of all, AI is a broad, it's a broad application class. I mentioned that, there are many smaller models. So let's just take, AI that could help us, better diagnose disease or solve cancer or make logistics more efficient. There are many potentially beneficial uses of machine learning and AI, where I don't think we should completely dismiss the whole class of applications as being, too depressing or too, like it's going to wreck the planet. The issue is we don't really know yet. And that's because we don't have data. We don't have good studies. We don't have good frameworks for what we want to really also study, which is the net balance. So there probably are many applications of AI which could lead to a lot of benefit if they're done efficiently, if they solve more problems than they create. And there's a narrative coming from a lot of AI proponents that we shouldn't get too distracted with AI's early impacts, because AI is going to save a lot more impacts than it's going to create, right? And to that, I would say, we need to see the numbers. And the problem with seeing the numbers is we don't really have the data. We don't have the frameworks. We don't have the consensus-based ways of measuring the benefits versus the cost. And that's something that we need to get moving on as well, because it could very well be that there could be applications that are super beneficial, and we want to know where those benefits are and what drives them. And we also want to know where things aren't beneficial and either sort of discourage those or put guardrails on those. And it's a bit of a wild west now with the claims we're seeing. But I do want to point out, like, yeah, as a class of technologies, these approaches could also lead to a lot of benefit. It's just we need to be able to measure it and be sure that we're getting benefit, and we're not there yet either.
I'll let Jack wrap this up, but I do want to say that we're really fortunate to have had you speak with us today. And I can imagine every college student in the country would benefit from hearing you.
Well, thanks for that, Fred. Appreciate that. And it was a pleasure being with you. And everyone, feel free to follow up. You can see my institution right there. If you Google my name, UC Santa Barbara, I'd be happy to follow up with conversations, sharing my slides, sharing our policy database, if I can be of assistance in any way.
Yeah, thank you, Eric. Thank you so much. And thank you, everyone,
Welcome.
for being
And
here.
thanks to MCAN for having me. Okay. I have one.
Take care, Eric. Thank you.